So for today's talk, I'm really happy to bring you this talk about the biblical locust from the Book of Revelations and their apocalyptic and iconographical connection to the medieval warhorse. I aim to explore apocalyptic iconography of the 11th to the 14th century and its connection to equestrian material culture, so objects and artifacts of the medieval era. Equestrian armour and equipment will be discussed, so I'll touch upon records from the PAS, which is a portable antiquities scheme, and it's all in mind really to discuss how the representation of the horse and its equipment in apocalyptic iconography, so imagery, despite perhaps being as far removed from reality, gives us some insight into how medieval horse equipment and how artists grappled with their depictions of the Book of Revelations and the breastplates of iron prior to horse armour usage. And as we go along, feel free to write questions in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So before we get into the apocalyptic images and the end of the world, let me just say a bit about the Warhorse project. So the AHRC Warhorse project is a multidisciplinary project run by the University of Exeter in collaboration with the University of East Anglia, the Royal Armouries in Leeds, and the PAS scheme from the British Museum. So it's aiming to conduct an archaeological study of warhorses in the medieval era by studying horse remains and assemblages, assessing material culture, and exploring landscapes for looking at horse breeding and training. So the project can create new information about the appearance and development of the warhorse and its social and military roles within the medieval era. So my work in particular has been focused on assisting the material culture package of the project with my colleague, postdoctoral fellow, Rob Bebley. And this work has included data cleaning the database, the PAS database, and working to identify heraldry for associated items on the database. So in terms of heraldry, I mean the families, the coats of arms, all that sort of stuff. And we get that a lot in harness pendants and mounts, which I will show you some later. And also collating the iconography of the medieval warhorse from this era. So I've been looking at sculptures, tapestries, and my favourite, the illuminated manuscripts. This is where my love for apocalyptic iconography began. But first, we must understand a little bit more about the medieval warhorse itself and the equipment before we start to assess the actual things and the iconography first. So before we dive into the representations of the apocalypse, it is important we spend a bit of time considering what the medieval warhorse was. Stereotypically, most of us think of the medieval warhorse as armoured, as shown by here. I'm just going to get a laser pointer and see if that works because you can see me pointing at things. There we go. Hopefully we can all see that. So yeah, so stereotypically we might think of the warhorse as this armoured example shown by the Wallace collection to the left. We may think of them as extremely tall in stature, fast and heavy to carry the armour. Partially, you would be right. The armoured horse you see above is a warhorse, but a warhorse typically seen in the later part of the 15th century. It is important to note that armour was reintroduced around the 12th century, so we do have to account in earlier warhorses for mail barding and more decorative heraldic caparisons. So by comparisons, you can see a horse. Sadly, his head's been cut off because we're not focused and interested in him, but that's a caparison, so it's like a cloth that goes over the horse. And we also want to focus on the harness pendants and equipment. So when it comes to the size, the medieval warhorse may appear smaller to our perceived standards. The warhorse of the medieval era was known as a great horse, the destrier, known for its strong hind legs and great for jousting or battle. The destrier was only on average perhaps 15 horse hands, and horse hands is an ancient measurement. So 15 horse hands is about 1.5 meters in height equivalent to today. So the destriers were typically stallions, and they weren't actually the most common horse in the battlefield. The courser was the most common, and it was light and swift rather than heavy. There is also the rancy, which is known for its typical pack horse role, so it does the sort of menial jobs, but it was also sometimes used within war. So when we do analyse the locusts and the apocalyptic iconography of the warhorse, we need to take note of what we're looking for and what we can learn from it. Remember, the horse was an integral, important animal to medieval society due to its connection with the hunt, heraldry, jousting tournaments, and even that chivalric theme of Arthurian legends. So it's only understandable that the horse would inspire the medieval imagination in regards to apocalyptic iconography of the times. So what are we focusing on when we assess the iconography of these locusts and these medieval warhorses? So the majority of manuscriptal evidence I'll be sharing with you will cover the 11th to the 14th centuries. So we're not particularly looking at the sort of armoured warhorse of the later periods, but more equipment, we're looking at the equipment of the saddle, the reins, the horseshoes, stirrup strap mounts and loops, and the breastbands that would have held the small finds like the harness pendants. We sometimes focus on the rider itself, so we look at, is the rider, part of the biblical imagination or the stories? Are they a medieval knight with a heraldic banner, or are they hunting? So we won't look at the rider too much in this, but we do bear that in mind. So the armour diagram on the left is there to help you understand the parts of the horse. In particular, we will be focusing on the stirrup. So here, the stirrup, the saddle, and the pectoral part, which is the front of the chest part of the horse. So the material culture that you can see here is from the PAS scheme, and this highlights to us how the medieval world interacted with the horses, particularly through heraldry. As you can see with the heraldic harness pendants, there's a great one here with the arms of England on, with a cadency mark. So cadency mark is, this one is called a label, and that differentiates, say, a father from his son within a monarchy or a family. And then you've also got these decorative strap mounts, and you've got harness mounts. Important to note is the saddle, and we see this a lot in iconography. So you have the pommel here, and the back is the cantle. So this is used to stabilize the rider, and you may see ones that are kind of enclosed to hold the rider in and to protect the lower torsos in joust or battle. So by highlighting this material culture, heraldry and its usage, we can apply this to our assessment of the apocalyptic iconography. Here are just a few examples of some other iconography, but it demonstrates the sort of equine equipment we're going to be focusing on. And it emphasizes the importance of the horse in medieval society. You might be able to already start to begin noticing the patterns and equipment that is depicted on some of these texts. I really particularly love the aquamanils here. So the aquamanils are like water jugs. And you can see the harness pendants and the bells. See here on the seal of Fulk V, Count of Anjou. And here you've got a little harness pendant, which is in the form of a bell. You've also got girth straps. So you've got the strap to hold the saddle in place. And you've also got the enclosing pommel and cantle on the saddle. So you can see this lovely guy is being kept sat in the saddle, and he's not going anywhere. So now it's time to bring you some revelations to you through the book of Revelations. By apocalypse, and we are talking about Christian apocalypse here, we mean the end of days from the New Testament in the Bible. The apocalyptical representation of the warhorse is rooted in the Bible. From the book of Revelations, it does show us how the horse played an integral part to the world prior to the medieval age, but it also shows how it may have captured the medieval imagination. So this is from the book of Revelations 9, verses 3 to 9. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle, and on their heads were as it were crowns like gold, and their faces were the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates, as it were breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots, many horses running to battle. The picture here, courtesy of John Allen, who is Exeter Cathedral's archaeologist, is of a misericord. So a misericord is a small wooden structure formed on the underside of a church seat. So you can see the church seat here, and this will be the structure underneath. And when it's folded up, you sort of it is intended to act as sort of like a shelf to support you in long position, long periods of prayer. So it really helps you. I mean, I wouldn't personally want to be leaning on this sort of creature during church, but hey ho. So this is a misericord number 41, and this is circa 1240 to 70. We can see the saddle, there we go, has the enclosing pommel and cantle with some reverse U-shaped stirrup loops. And this is what appears to be Malebinding around the whole of the horse. And you see these wiggly lines which demarcate and mark out the Malebinding. So the principal investigator of the project, Oliver Crichton, he had the look to have this image brought to his attention. And after seeing it, I needed to know more. How did the locust link to the medieval warhorse I'd come to spend all my time researching? How did artists depict the passage and revelations of the time? And what can we learn about horse equipment that we have been working with that are held in the PAS database? So firstly, how did artists grapple with their depiction of the breastplates of iron? And, you know, in terms of the apocalyptic iconography, despite being, as I said, removed from reality, how does it give us insight into medieval horse equipment? So I began the research to see if I could find any examples of these locusts hidden in other texts. And the first one I can't show you, sadly, just because copyright purposes, it's held in the Morgan Library and there's an online exhibition going on. But the link I have put it at the end of the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to go and have a look at it in your own time. And that's from the Las Hergas Apocalypse, which is circa 1220. And it depicts the riders wearing mail, but not the locusts. Now, the locusts don't necessarily look too much like horses, but on first inspection, one could assume the locust is wearing armor. There's like a white highlight to it in the breast and hind regions, which is very similar to horses. That's where their power comes from the hind region. But when you compare it to other depictions, it actually just looks like it's just accentuating the muscle on the actual locusts. So it's really important using iconography that we take into account the artistic nature and license of these manuscripts, but then also think about how it allows us to assess trends in horse equipment and how they were depicted. An example you can see to the left here is from the Salden Supra, 14th century, and it's very similar to the Exeter Misericord I've just showed you, minus the horse equipment. We can see it has the gait of the warhorse and depicts the locusts from Revelations, or as a colleague once said, it kind of reminds us of babies being swaddled. Notice how the Malebinding, it has those lines around it, and this depicts the armor. Something we can also see on the Canonici Apocalypse. This is from the same century, with Malebinding covering the entirety of the locust, very similar to a comparison. This example shows a range of horse equipment. So you've got the rider held in with the pommel and cantle to keep him stable. You've got the girth buckle holding the saddle in place, horseshoes to aid durability of the hoof, clearly are illustrated. But also note how the stirrup loop is triangular. And keep an eye out for this because you'll see this in another manuscript later. What is interesting is that I did mention that Malebinding and armor wasn't really reintroduced until the 12th century. So it's interesting that we actually found something that's quite rare. So it's rare to find Malebinding depicted earlier in iconography than the 13th century. However, Rob Webley, my colleague, came across this folio 23 from the Bamberger Apocalypse of the 11th century, which is one of the earliest examples of Malebinding depicted that we have personally found so far in a horse or a horse-like figure. So if any of you do know of anything earlier than the 11th century depicting Malebinding, please give us a shout. It did get us quite excited due to how early it was within the time. And the way the Malebinding has been depicted is very different to later examples. Despite not showcasing the examples of horse equipment here, because there's no rider, it does in a literal sense remind us of the breastplates of iron mentioned in Revelations. So it makes you wonder, does it reveal a simplicity to horse armor earlier on within the medieval period? And also the circular pattern that you have. You know, it's used there, it's almost something to bear in mind for the next examples I'm going to show you. Now, I'm moving away from the locust now and just looking at apocalyptic imagery with horses. And the image to the right we'll talk about first. So this is from the Silos Apocalypse, which is circa late 11th to early 12th century. And this depicts the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So we all know those, yeah? And if we note the white horse to the right. So if you don't really know a lot about horses, you might instinctively say, oh, it's got squiggly lines on it. And could this be Malebinding? Now, unfortunately, it goes all the way down to the hoof. So this means that it's probably the artist trying to create the technique of the coat of the horse. However, you know, when you look at the actual depiction here of the horses in general, you start to notice the harness pendants. Now, note that they are circular. When I compare it to this one in a minute, we'll see how that's important to the archaeological record. Notice the stirrup loops. They're in inverted U shape yet again, similar to the misericord in Exeter, which is only a century later. And as for the saddle, it's kind of hard to argue whether this has a pommel and a cantle. I'd be interested to know your thoughts because it's not very clear. Now, if we move on and compare the Trinity Apocalypse, which is the 13th century, if we focus on the blue horse here, now, if you notice, it has very similar patterns to the Bamberg Apocalypse with the Malebinding. So could we argue it's Malebinding? Now, the circuit pattern is very similar, yes, I agree. But I think in this case, it is more just the markings on the horse is a dappling effect of the colour of the horse itself. What I really want to pay attention to is noting the harness pendant. So the harness pendant here on the breastband is a shield shaped. Now, comparing it to the Silas Apocalypse on the right, the shield-shaped harness pendants, most of them in the PAS database that we've been working with, have a rough date between 1200 and 1400, and we date that from the heraldry. And we also know from rolls of arms and other accounts that heraldry fully developed within the 13th century. Now, we also know from the archaeological record that circular harness pendants come before the shield-shaped ones. So it kind of fits in with the chronology of these manuscripts. If we go and look at the saddle, we don't really see the pommel. It's really hard to see, but the cantle is there. And the stirrup loops, they are triangular, just like the Canonici Apocalypse of a similar date. There is also a development within the girth buckle here, so it's a double girth buckle. And we're starting to see through some of the iconography we're assessing that this is becoming quite common in the later periods. So in conclusion, by comparing these apocalyptic examples to apocalyptic iconography that depicts locusts, it is evident that these examples are relevant to our discussions of not only how the medieval warhorse and its equipment were perceived, but also how and why they could have been used. We do have to remember, though, that there is artistic license, but we can begin to match up iconographical depictions within material culture, perhaps use it to understand typologies, so shapes within the equipment, so how they form over time, and try to establish chronological frameworks for our understanding of the medieval warhorse. As our iconographical horse hunt continues, alongside our work on material culture for the project, it'll be really interesting to see what other depictions, material comes to light and what we can learn from them. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions regarding the talk or anything I do as a student, feel free to ask and pop questions in the chat, which I'm sure there's already quite a few. I will answer them to the best I can. I've also put some further resources here, particularly if you want to look at the manuscript I was on about that I couldn't show you. It's the link here, so folio 94. It's a stunning piece. The AHRC Warhorse has a Twitter, so that's a handle if you want to give us a follow and follow the project through. We also have our blog website here, so we've just been writing blog posts. We have them every month. And yeah, I think that's it. So have a look at the resources, and thanks for listening.